Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Nancy Mader, and I am the Director of Transition Projects for the Federation for Children with Special Needs. Just a few things about the Federation. We are open. We are accepting calls. We are, providing free training such as this. Our Facebook page has a Facebook Live training every single day at 2 o'clock. We have a training this evening that's posted on our Facebook page as well as our website. Our website has updates as well. The RTSC is also recruiting new SESPs, special education surrogate parents. So if you are interested in that, please go to their website. And now I'm going to introduce our guest, Kelly Challen. My printer ran out of paper today, so I have to look at my other screen to read this because it printed out a blank piece of paper for me and let me know that I'm out. So my husband's on the way to Staples right now. So Kelly Challen is the Director of Transition Services and Assistant Director of NESCA. She has a master's in education. Ms. Challen has been engaged in assessment, development, and direction of transition-focused programming for teenagers and young adults with a wide array of developmental and learning abilities since 2004. While Ms. Challen has special expertise in working with children with autism, spectrum disorders, and Asperger profiles, she enjoys working with students with a range of cognitive, learning, communication, social, emotional, and/or behavioral needs. Ms. Challen joined NESCA in 2013. She believes that the transition to post-secondary learning, living, and working is ongoing, and that there is no age too early or too late to begin the planning process. Moreover, any transition plan should be person-centered, individualized, and include steps beyond the completion of secondary school. Through her role at NESCA, Ms. Challen provides a wide array of services, including individualized transition planning, consultation, pre-college coaching, assessment, training, and program development services. She is particularly skilled in providing transition assessment and consultation aimed at determining optimal timing for a student's transition to college, technical training, adult learning, and/or employment, as well as identifying and developing appropriate programs and services necessary for minimizing critical skill gaps. So welcome, Kelly. Thank you so much for joining us today. We want you to know to please hold questions till the end. There will be time at the end, but if there's something that you like, if Kelly uses an acronym you don't know, if you need a little clarification on something, put that in the chat. Otherwise, ask your questions in the Q&A and then we'll talk about them at the end.
Thanks so much, Nancy, for the introduction. And yes, I'm going to try to leave plenty of time at the end so that Nancy and I can jointly answer questions and sort of pool our knowledge together. So we're certainly living through an extremely unique time in history, certainly the first and hopefully the last time that we're experiencing a pandemic, and we're really having to rethink many aspects of education. One of the most uplifting aspects of current times is that we're all working together to figure out the best way to educate students and prepare them for adult life. I think we're getting better at using technology, which is exciting and important. Getting better at connecting with each other locally. We've had the opportunity to co-present with a lot of wonderful groups. I'm really excited to be working with the Federation on this talk this morning. But we're also having opportunities to connect with professionals and families across the country to learn how transition's being done, in every state, I think, in a little bit more real time. And, I'm finding myself part of more social media communities with school-based providers and other professionals. And so I think there's something really exciting about the resource sharing going on right now that is going to enable us to better support transition age students in the long term. But at the same time, there's things that haven't actually changed as part of this situation. And, the laws and expectations for delivering transition services are the same, even though we may have to be a lot more creative about how we're doing that. So I do want to just, with that in mind, briefly touch upon the legal foundation for transition services. I think it's sort of like, let's always go back to what we know when we're not sure, we're not sure what we're doing, right? So if you're a parent of a child with special needs, or you're a professional or an educator supporting a student with special needs, you're probably familiar with the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, right? IDEA 2004. This law guarantees students with disabilities an opportunity for free and appropriate public education, FAPE. And FAPE is still, something that all students are entitled to right now. So I do want to read you the first line of Title 34, Subpart A of the IDEA 2004 regulations. The purpose of this part are to ensure that all children with disabilities have available to them a free, appropriate public education that emphasizes special education and related services designed to meet their unique needs and prepare them for further education, employment, and independent living. So I just want to restate that because it's really powerful. Special education is about having FAPE that prepares students for education, employment, and independent living. Everything that we're doing for students on IEPs should be preparing them for post-secondary adult life. And special education and transition services during COVID-19 are still about preparing students for post-high school life. Certainly the federal law is also what mandates that students on IEPs are provided with transition assessment, goals, and services. But what are transition services? One of the things that's complicated about delivering transition services is that they're broad. They can cover a lot of ground. Transition services are defined as a coordinated set of activities that's designed to be within a results-oriented process that's focused on improving academic and functional achievement of the child in order to facilitate the child's movement from school to post-school activities, including post-secondary education, vocational education, integrated employment, continuing and adult education, adult services, independent living, or community participation. So we could be preparing students for all of these activities, or any subset of the activities, really. And the coordinated set of activities is based on the individual child's needs, taking into account the child's strengths, preferences, and interests. So this is one of the first, really, one of the major places in special education that we're thinking about a student's strengths and their preferences and their interests. We're not just being deficit-based with transition services. We're really looking at what's the student good at, what do they like doing, what are they interested in. And so that's part of the basis for transition services. And it includes instruction, related services, community experiences, development of employment and other post-school adult living objectives, and if appropriate, acquisition of daily living skills and functional vocational evaluation. And certainly those daily living skills are important for most students on IEPs, if you really think about it. And I would say if you're at home with your child right now, or with family member right now, you're getting a good sense of life skills, especially life skills in the absence of structure, right? So transition services are quite robust. There's an impressive latitude in terms of what funds can be used for in terms of providing transition services to students, and that's exciting. This is just a slide that I use to try to sort of simplify what the laws say. So we focus on the student's strengths, preferences, interests, and needs. We expect that the student will participate in this process. They come to the team meetings, they're part of transition service planning. That transition assessment is going to inform the IEP, so that there's assessment happening that informs everything that we're putting in the IEP, that the team will use the transition planning form in the state of Massachusetts, and that the IEP will document and progress the student's progress toward measurable post-secondary goals in the following 4 areas: post-secondary education, employment, independent living, and community involvement. And the process is driven by the student's vision, which is their sort of post-secondary vision, their goals for after high school life. It's results-oriented. It's coordinated among a team of family and friends and educators and community providers, right? There's a lot of coordination that goes into it. And it focuses not just on the student's academic progress, but also on their functioning. With regard to transition assessment, it really is different from many other assessments that we do in education because it's an ongoing process. And it includes formal and informal assessment measures, which need to be age appropriate. But it generally focuses on the 3 following referral questions. So we're discerning a student's post-secondary goals. In other words, trying to figure out what the student wants to do or aspires to do after leaving public education. It focuses on gaining an understanding of the student's needs, strengths, preferences, and interests. And it certainly focuses on measuring their performance, right? We want to know how well we're doing in making progress toward our post-secondary goals and where we might need to tweak our transition plan. In comparison to a lot of other types of assessment that are part of the IEP process, I think transition assessment's really one of the easiest types of assessment to carry out remotely for students with a wide range of developmental and learning profiles. I'm certainly aware of school districts right now that are carrying out transition assessment. I'm doing some assessments myself at the same time as school districts, or maybe we're being consulted to support that process. But I know that this is possible to be doing right now and happening right now. If a school is carrying out transition assessment for students, involving staff who are most familiar with the student and have the best rapport with the student tends to be a very important factor in getting accurate results. I think this is really even more important during a time of remote testing because we're seeing kids through screens sometimes. We don't know exactly what's going on behind them or next to them. And you want to ensure that you're getting accurate and honest results from a student when you can. Or you want to know if you're not getting good results from a student so you know to seek out other sources of data. So certainly familiarity with that individual, some rapport goes a long way. And there's certainly lots of common formal and informal transition assessment tools that can be used remotely. So especially things like structured interviews, parent and teacher questionnaires or rating skills, student self-report measures. I did put an asterisk by vocational skill tests there because there are some computer-based vocational aptitude tests that are designed to be completed independently by the student, but those are only appropriate for a student who can meet the language and attention demands of the tests. And there are many typical vocational aptitude tests that would be less safe or appropriate to carry out in current conditions. One of my colleagues, Dr. Ann Helmuth, did a talk for the Federation just a couple of weeks ago about a testing model that we're using at NESCA, where we actually have a plexiglass setup and we're able to test a student while we're in separate rooms from the students. And so I have been able to do some of those other standardized vocational aptitude tests using that model, but certainly the testing tools have to be selected for each student really individually. That's always been the case with the transition assessment, but I think that's even more so the case when we're being creative in our testing. Observations are definitely a little more difficult to carry out right now, but some teams are getting really creative, having a parent, video different activities of daily life or particular area of concern, even, being able to live stream an activity to a clinician or evaluator through a video conferencing tool. There is also the opportunity for an evaluator to join, a class video conference call. Everyone's going to have to make a decision about how appropriate it is or disruptive it is, but that's an opportunity there and very successful sometimes. And then some school districts are actually recording the video classes that they're having for students, usually because they want students who can't attend live to be able to watch that recording later. But a teacher could rewatch a recording of their own class as part of an assessment process, right? So there's different ways to be getting certain observational data if it ends up being needed. And certainly access to technology like a laptop or a Chromebook or an iPad and a webcam makes direct testing of students easier. But there are some online transition assessment tools that are actually optimized for administration on a cell phone screen. I'm learning. And questionnaires and structured interviews, as I mentioned before, are easy to administer by mail or by phone interview. So there's lots of ways to get data about the kinds of things we might be interested in learning about right now, even in this sort of state of remote learning. In terms of transition services, there are lots of ways that schools are still able to carry these services out remotely and are carrying them out effectively. What transition services are carried out depends on what's in the student's IEP. So exactly the same way that it did before remote learning, right? Sort of what you're entitled to has to do with what the team has talked about you really needing as part of this process. Students who've had life skills instruction at school or home services as part of their IEP can still continue that service. If OT or ABA services were needed to support life skills instruction at school, those services should continue at home, although they might look really different remotely. And then for students who would be, like, say, taking a personal finance or consumer skills class, or having budgeting or money skills unit as part of a life skills curriculum, they can continue this learning at home remotely. And there's all these different options for, synchronous versus asynchronous learning, the things that are like live instruction versus a recorded lesson, or online interactive curricula, paper worksheets. Some staff are getting really creative with interactive worksheets online. So there's a lot of different options for being able to get those money skills or other, specific life skills that are part of a curriculum. Students who are working on grocery shopping skills and cooking at school can practice cooking the same recipes at home, right? We have this great opportunity for generalizing skills now that maybe was a little more complicated because kids were tired at the end of the day before. If you were cooking lunch at home, at school, you could do that at home. You might be able to start learning to purchase groceries online using Instacart or Prime. That's going to be, many students would be doing that type of online grocery shopping anyways in adult life. So there's an opportunity to practice some of that right now. Parents and teachers definitely have to work together to determine how students are going to be learning to online shop safely. So sometimes that might mean using a gift card as opposed to a parent's credit card if that's an area of concern for a student, but getting creative in terms of thinking about the money and the shopping skills. And then I would say, for parents with kids being home all day, it's really important to read your most recent progress report closely and talk with your child's teacher to know sort of where the student was with skill levels before they came home, and what they had been working on and what tasks they were able to carry out at school, so that we can allow them to continue working on the same skills at home, right? We want to be progressing forward, or at least maintaining. And a great example of this that I've given before is that I have a colleague who works in a public school and teaches a class of students ages 18 to 22. And she's had to talk with almost each of the parents of the students in that class to tell them they don't need to make lunch for their students, because that's something those kids have been doing every single day at school. So they were doing it for 6 months at school. They still have the skills, and we want to make sure that we're giving students the opportunity to use the life skills that they've been building at home and to continue building those life skills. And that means, time and planning and mess and a lot of different things, but that's so important. For students who are working on cleaning skills, they might continue this learning at home. There's some great YouTube videos that can be used for repeated instruction, and certainly educators might be needed to help develop, visuals or maybe, some technology-based reminders or things like that, so that a student has a system that they can use to consistently carry out skills at home. Community engagement. If you're on social media, you've probably seen a number of posts about virtual field trips to museums or state parks, aquariums, other landmarks that can be accessed for free. We're seeing an increasing number of these over time, which is great. And many educators are taking advantage of these opportunities in lieu of typical community outings. Maybe their class had a field trip that they went on every Friday, and now we can do a virtual field trip. So if students had community trips as part of their program or on their IEPs, teachers can still lead virtual field trips. You can start the day with a discussion about the travel that would be needed to get to and from the trip, types of questions the students might ask while they're on the field trip, behavioral expectations for visiting the location, take the virtual field trip together and process the trip afterward, right? Ask students to self-reflect afterward. Some high school students and transition classes are actually partnering together within one district or across districts so that students are able to have these experiences in a slightly larger group. These can certainly also be completed as inclusive activities, for instance, a visit to the US Constitution as part of a gen ed history class. And then in terms of social engagement, this is an excellent opportunity to work on learning to use technology and social media, right, to connect socially with others. So we have an increased number of opportunities right now for practicing text messaging, phone skills, video conference skills, webinar skills, and other, age-appropriate social media technologies. And I think this is really important because these types of communication skills are likely to be, increasingly important for social connections over the next year and beyond, but they're also going to be important for employment, in sort of a post-COVID world, and they're going to be important for accessing education. Just sort of like we're going to be leaning into a lot of these technologies for communication over time, and it really makes sense to be learning these and working on these effectively now. For any school programs that relied heavily on real-life exploration of community resources, which is a lot of transition programs or programming for transition-age students. So there might have been programs that relied on shopping trips, visits to the library, touring other local resources, going out and volunteering once a week. Teachers are having to be a lot more creative right now, and they are having to do an extraordinary amount of outreach and research and prep work to be able to sort of simulate experiences similar to some of the in vivo things we were doing before. So, for instance, rather than being able to just take students to visit a local police department to learn about law enforcement, a teacher might have to do a lot of outreach and preparation ahead of time, and then students could do like a virtual interview with an officer, maybe use Google Earth to explore what the building looks like from outside or how to get there. There are ways to, again, sort of simulate or get close to some of these real life experiences and to learn valuable information about the community. One important consideration right now that may or may not be listed as a transition service on your child's IEP is community service. So most of our public schools have community service graduation requirements. Seniors are pretty much finishing up right now, but sometimes these things are waived or eliminated or reduced, right now because of current situations. But I do want to point out that there's a good number of volunteer activities that can still be done remotely, such as mentoring or being a virtual companion for a senior, fundraising. And there's a student I'm working with who recently began researching a volunteer program called Be My Eyes, where he's actually a sighted volunteer. And so individuals who are blind and low vision are able to call this student. They can, show something on the screen, like a prescription label that they're not sure what the expiration date is, or a food product, and they're wondering about the date on it. And the student's able to really like be their eyes virtually. And so that's a great, service opportunity that I think is, rewarding for the student, engagement with the community, and again, fulfilling community service requirements like many high school students have fulfilled community service requirements for, for years and years. And as a general rule, like I always encourage talking with a team about how to fulfill community service requirements rather than just waiving the requirement because a student has a disability. And I think this is still really important in the age of remote learning, right? I think it's really important to find ways to be part of community and to help students figure out, sort of where their place is even remotely. Schools should also be continue to be connecting students with community agencies that are offering supports, and especially the agencies that are going to be available or necessary for the student to engage with after public education. So for instance, independent living centers have been doing some wonderful outreach right now. I've seen a lot of great social groups or, young men, young women's groups, peer mentoring experiences, and it's important for students to start, working with those independent living centers if they haven't been before. Adult human service agencies are still doing orientations. They're still doing intakes. 688 referrals are still happening so that we can have, a transition plan in place between a public school and an adult public agency. And services definitely vary by office and agency right now. And we see changes, right, on a daily or weekly basis in terms of what's being offered, and we're going to continue to see that. So it is really important to check with your school team, make sure that they're in touch with adult human service agencies, and that there's sort of a clear process for managing referrals and information sharing at this time. And you can always, as a parent, reach out directly to get information in a lot of different directions. As far as employment, many students have career exploration goals on their IEPs that can still be carried out pretty much exactly as written. So students can continue to take career interest inventories or do career research online, report on career research within a portfolio, or present to their classmates, do a PowerPoint via video conference, or record something and share it. Resume writing is still something that's quite easy to continue working on, especially with shared documents like Google Docs, things like that. And students who had been planning to apply for summer jobs or jobs in the community can still be supported in going through most of that process. And I think we're still not quite sure what summer is going to look like, but students can learn to find job applications, read criteria for preparing the application materials, practice interview skills virtually, really gaining those experiences and being ready for employment, at the time that there are jobs available that the student's comfortable with. And I know this is highly personal and sensitive decision in terms of when students go out and are doing work in the community, but there are some students who are working in the community right now, or who may be looking to work in the community over the summer. And if that's part of their transition plan, and they're planning to do that, even though school is remote, they would still, should still have support with that job application process or with finding those jobs, if that's something that the student is planning to do and that the family's comfortable with. As far as job exploration, real life activities such as worksite visits or informational interviews can be carried out remotely. This can be done by, if a class had certain community partners that they worked with before for job sites, they can reach out to those same community partners who've typically hosted students on tours, and see if those people will host a virtual tour of a worksite, right? Some educators are making use of online video job exploration tools that might be available through the One Stop Career Center or a transition curriculum or another similar resource. And for students who have either pre-vocational training or had volunteer or paid employment as a transition service, it's really important to continue practicing the technical skills that students had learned previously so that students aren't losing any transferable skills that they've learned. So say if a student was doing mail delivery as part of a job at school, they might be able to continue retrieving and sorting mail for their family at home, right? This would require a parent and teacher working together to try to replicate the system and visuals and natural supports that the student was using to successfully carry out the task at school. I've seen some students were maybe rolling silverware or doing something, as far as table setting, things like that. But, whatever skills were being used successfully as part of a job, we should try to find ways to continue working on those and maintaining those skills at home. And many students had also been referred for pre-employment transition services, pre-ETS, which is, through Mass Rehabilitation Commission or directly through a local vendor. And families should still be provided with information and introduction to these agencies so that they can take advantage of the pre-ETS services that are being delivered remotely right now. For a lot of the vendors that I've been in touch with who deliver pre-ETS services, most seem to still be delivering individual or group sessions using Zoom or Skype or FaceTime and phone. And sometimes we see, shifts in the service delivery around July 1st when the fiscal year sort of transitions over. So I think it's going to be really important to make sure that you're still in touch with those agencies and see what kinds of services are going to be available for summer and fall. I included this slide just because many students have an IEP objective or a line on their transition action plan that indicates a student will apply to appropriate post-secondary programs, and it might not be explicit about the number or the type of programs. It just says they're going to apply. And I think it's extremely valuable for families and especially for students to be able to think about a wide range of different options that might be appropriate to explore as transition services are being delivered. So some students will be looking at, four-year colleges only, but some students might be comparing community college or looking at, vocational programs, or might be thinking of going to a college prep program as a step after high school. There's different kinds of employment training that students might be looking at, or other, day programs and life skills programs. And I think students have a right to explore and be making choices about those things and be supported through that process. I am including some resources at the very end of the presentation, and I think you should be getting copies of the slides if you haven't already, and so you'll have resources if you want to do any additional exploration of post-secondary learning and training programs from home. So as far as preparation for post-secondary learning and training, if an IEP or transition plan talks about a student taking part in a guidance curriculum, which I see often, you know, sort of in one of the sections of the transition planning form, that they're going to take part in the regular guidance curriculum. So if that's happening, the school should be finding ways to continue delivering typical guidance curriculum remotely. And families should have an understanding of how coursework is going to be selected for next year. I know that there are, you know, we have a lot of college-focused towns and high schools in Massachusetts. And so if you happen to live in one of these districts and say your 12th grader who's on an IEP and maybe is going to be continuing services next year, you know, is getting inundated with information about college decision making, because I think a lot of guidance teams are actually being more proactive about the college process right now. And so a student might be getting that kind of information, but not be getting information related to their own post-secondary learning or training exploration. And it's important to bring that up with your team, you know, to really identify if some of the things that are coming home are not individualized and kind of speak up. For students who are planning on going to college, some 11th grade students may have been doing initial college services at this time in their programming, and that should still be carried out. This is a time of year when a lot of 11th graders would also be asking teachers for recommendations, for college recommendations for next fall, and so making sure that that's happening so that students are sort of ready to go is important. And then even before this period of sheltering in, many colleges and universities already offered virtual tours, or tours of those colleges could be found on third-party websites. And now more colleges are rolling out virtual tours, virtual information sessions, informational interviews via Zoom, and other online orientation materials. So this is kind of exciting because there is a lot more, you know, sort of visual and video information that's available for learning about programs. And some students are actually finding that they enjoy taking online tours or doing a sort of a virtual information session better than they, you know, enjoyed going in person. Sometimes this might be that they feel like they're able to ask more questions without their parent there, or perhaps just be more active in the process. So, you know, it's interesting because some students are sort of more able to access learning about post-secondary education in this way. And certainly educators can continue to support students in taking individual or group college and program tours and having the students complete evaluations of the college or program, you know, as part of classes or transition services if that's something that was going on before. I have also been receiving many emails about virtual orientations for inclusive college programs and transition programs. So I'd say that, you know, all programs that try to recruit students for any way, you know, are getting creative about how to make sure that they can still have an admissions process happening now. Some schools, I've seen some high schools that'll take students for a visit to disability support services at a community college or four-year college so that students become familiar with differences and, you know, differences in rights, differences in responsibilities. And so, you know, certainly these types of information sessions about the transition from high school to college supports are still possible remotely. And in fact, you know, many admissions and disability support professionals and, you know, financial aid professionals, they're sort of missing having students on their campuses, and they're really enjoying having high school students reach out or classes reach out. You know, some people are very eager to connect right now, and so it's a good opportunity for students to do some learning. Also, while PSATs were pushed to fall for schools, and some of the SATs were certainly missed this spring, students might take practice SAT exams right now, right? Students could still be sort of building the experience with the format if it seems appropriate or if it's an important transition assessment activity. And I think I do see a lot of sometimes where, you know, formal tests, standardized tests are skipped because we're nervous about a student being anxious about the test. I think, you know, it's really, it's sort of an important transition assessment activity to try some of these standardized tests, right? And I think there's nothing to lose. You never have to turn over scores if you're going to end up going to a test optional college anyway, or going the community college route where the testing isn't required. But I think there's sort of nothing to lose but everything to gain. And I think, you know, really thinking about ways to still be gaining experience with this, even though we're not able to administer the tests in person right now, is important. And then finally, while this isn't a usual part of a transition service that would be happening in spring for 11th graders, some students might want to be looking at college applications, writing a college essay now so that they can have an idea of how to move through that process in August and leave more time for academic catch-ups than that they might need to do in fall. I mean, I think we don't really know what school is going to look like in the fall. We don't, you know, really know sort of how consistent it's going to be, but I think we can anticipate that there's going to be a certain amount of stress, right? And so if students are going to be thinking about applying to colleges, if we can sort of, you know, front load this process now and over the summer and remove some of those activities from their plate, or get, you know, again, most of the process done, that only leaves room for students to focus on whatever else is coming up this fall. Some students might be enrolled right now, although a lot of these programs are sort of ending, but might be enrolled in Inclusive College or like a MACI program, which is the Massachusetts Inclusive Concurrent Enrollment Initiative program. And so, you know, some of those programs have been rethinking how to support students during the period of sheltering in, or sort of reduced social contact. And there definitely should be outreach between students and college staff and the high school contact who's been facilitating the program. You know, there needs to be a lot of outreach as we're sort of planning for fall for students who've been, you know, applying or thinking about that. And, you know, sometimes if, let's say, social engagement was the goal of the program, there might actually be inclusive social opportunities happening, like gaming online or check-ins with staff and mentors or other activities. But it shouldn't be that the inclusive nature of the program has just ceased altogether. You want to have some outreach and some connection there. I am also working with a number of students who had been dually enrolled in college courses this spring. For some students, they managed the shift to remote learning beautifully. Other students weren't successful and had to drop and maybe transition to taking an independent study through their high school. If participation in the sort of dual enrollment college course was an important transition service, if the idea was for the student to get ready to be successful, then we have to wonder if all of this transition really made for an effective transition service. And the team might need to talk about whether the format for spring, you know, provided the intending learning, or whether it needs to be repeated in the summer. Maybe what we're now aiming for is for the student to become adept in remote college learning, because that might be what we want them to be able to do for fall, so we could repeat that over the summer. Or maybe we need to wait and be sort of doing that service later. Also, given that we don't know what college is going to look like I said, we have, you know, all students are going to need to be ready to manage remote college classes. And in some ways, you know, it's like we sort of don't know what higher ed's going to look like in a lot of ways going forward over time. So I think remote learning skills are just going to be more important skills over time. And that's something to just be thinking about as far as transition services. It's definitely worth noting that a higher proportion of students are thinking about taking gap years right now rather than continuing to their expected post-secondary learning environments. Certainly team input for families who are trying to make this decision is useful. And I would just emphasize that while most colleges allow students to defer acceptances, a lot of colleges have a limit on the number of students who can defer admissions per year. And so if this is something that a student's thinking about, you know, you want to be having that conversation now and making the decision early. Even though deferrals are often accepted, you know, right up through August, they may run out of spots. And so a student may be thinking about taking a gap year and not sort of right in to do that until August, and then college may not be able to allow that at that point in time. So this is a decision to be thinking about pretty actively now and talking with a school team about. I do want to point out that self-determination needs to be a central part of any transition service going on. So given that instruction's been reduced by half right now, some transition services might have been cut out, right? Students should be able to make choices about which transition services they want to be learning and focusing on, right? It's a great way to work on self-determination and to sort of narrow what students are working on. Choice boards are a great type of graphic organizer, so I put a couple of examples here, and many schools are starting to use these, and students can choose to complete one or several activities. They could complete the activities in order. These are just a few examples, and one of them is from Teachers Pay Teachers, and the second one's from Teacher Vision, just to make sure that I'm citing. So I'm going to just talk about a few more considerations, and then we'll open it up to questions. Learning at home is really different than learning at school. I think we all know this by now. Whether we're working with kids learning at home or whether we're trying to teach our own kids or doing a little bit of both. You know, home is different than school, and sometimes we're working with really black and white thinkers, you know, who think school should only happen at school and shouldn't be happening at home, and that's complicated. Some students are just having a lot of difficulty making this leap, and they might respond better to working just on life skills, because life skills normally happen at home, you know, and so maybe they're doing a little bit less of the sort of traditional academic instruction, a little bit more functional academic instruction, like measuring that goes along with cooking, you know, as opposed to a worksheet with fractions. We need to make sure that students are accessing age and developmentally appropriate materials. You know, I think especially right now where it's like the universe is inundated with teacher resources and remote learning resources and activities for parents to be doing at home with their children. And there are a lot of fabulous web-based resources being offered for free, but you want to pay attention to the fact that the materials that your child, you know, your students using are age appropriate, and address that with the team if that's not happening. You know, every school district is handling remote learning in a slightly different manner. So some students only have access to asynchronous learning, so the learning that's not happening in real time, and others have more access to synchronous learning or live, but maybe the kid's not even able to get there even though the school's offering it. You know, think about what direct instruction is needed for your child, your student, to be able to make progress. If a student needs more or less direct instruction than is being offered for the general ed, talk with your team, you know, or if a schedule's not meeting your child's need, talk with your team. I think, you know, this is such an important time to be speaking up in a collaborative manner, to be offering ideas. You know, it's sort of like, here's what I think might work. Is there a way we could try this? If you notice that some activities are just easier for your child to complete without support, bring that up. These are the things that, you know, he actually can do for 7 minutes without my being in the room. Can we get more of those, you know? And see if there's any way to increase some of the types of activities that the student's being successful with. If you need training or have questions or, you know, see needs of your child's that are important and aren't being met, ask for it, you know, be specific. And as a parent or an advocate or professional working with parents, it's vital that families let school know what's working, what's not working, what they think might work. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, you know, we're living in this totally novel time. No one's an expert in educating a child with special needs remotely, right? That's just, none of us have all the answers. It's not the same as homeschooling or making a, you know, an active choice to homeschool. And parents often know their children best, right? They sort of notice things, and you really have to speak up with just any and all ideas. And everyone's going to come in with open mind, open ears, and just sort of see how we can work together on this. So with all of that said, we're going to open it up to questions. And Nancy, I don't know if there's anything that, if you have like any other thoughts to put you on the spot.
Great, thank you so much. You know, I think one of the most important things to think about right now is just being realistic about things, like what your limitations as parents, because you and I, Kelly, are both parents of kids on IEPs, you know, and what are your limitations and what are your child's limitations, and how can you best meet everybody's needs? You know, I think that's really the way that families have to think about things, because we can't do everything and work and teach and parent and all of these things. So I think that that's a huge piece of letting ourselves just be the best that we can. And then, well, let's go to questions here, and then maybe we can, it will spark some things in here. Okay, so here's a good question from Karen Donovan. Can you discuss more ideas on how to work those vocational, pre-vocational skills remotely?
I mean, I think it so depends on the student and where they're at. But, you know, some of the technical kinds of things are some of the things we talked about, right? So like one skill that I think about that's a really critical sort of vocational, pre-vocational skill for some students might be typing, right? So you could be doing a lot of work. There's some great websites that give good feedback that are sort of motivating that a student might be able to, you know, to use to build up that skill. As we talked about, I mean, soft skills like communication skills, you know, are something that can completely be worked on. But then as far as other skills, it depends on if we're thinking about money management, if we're thinking about certain types of cleaning skills. I mean, you know, do you have access to a photocopier at home or not? Some people actually do, and I realize that's, you know, not everybody, but thinking about what are the tools that you already have around the house that might be similar to tools that a student would be able to use in a workplace. And I do think, I mean, this isn't something that you should just be you know, solely responsible for on the parent side, right? There's sort of that informed discussion with the team, and I do think it has to do with what are some of the pre-vocational or vocational activities that were happening at school, what are some of the pre-vocational vocational activities that were being planned for, right, that would have been next progressions, and then how do we sort of replicate those at home? And if there's certain materials you don't have at home, but that are absolutely necessary for the student, well, there might be a way for some of those to be transported from school to home so the student can be, you know, working with a certain vocational kit or, you know, certain kind of filing setup that they were working with at school. You know, again, there's a lot of variability in terms of what kinds of materials are being sent home or transported home by program. And I think this is an area where it is important to talk about, you know, exactly what the skills are that we're working on and what materials are needed to do that. So there's sort of that two-pronged approach of what were they using before and are there certain materials they need, and then what do you have at home that we can actually work on.
Right. And I think it can even be more simple than that. If you have a young child, you know, who's 14, they don't even know what work is. So they
Right.
can watch, you know, they could do an interest inventory and then watch YouTube videos of what that job looks like, or go to the college that they want to, you know, they think they want to attend and the degree they think they want. And you can look at the courses recommended for that. And that can kind of, I mean, there's so many things vocationally that you can do that are quite simple. How many
Yeah.
step directions can they follow? If you give them a chore, do they ask a follow-up question to clarify it, or do they just do it wrong? And then you come back and help and correct them. You know, that's a really important vocational skill, to get clarification. You know, that's something that could get them fired from a job very easily if they just go and do it wrong every time and they don't get follow-up information. So there's a lot of things, you know, just getting a baseline for where your student is vocationally, so you have that understanding as a parent, and then moving forward from there too, you know. So
well, it's funny, I think about these, you know, these customer service skills. So I've had a number of students who you know, were a great fit in some ways for jobs at like Home Depot or Lowe's after high school, and, you know, got connected with the job. But when you work in a setting like that, if a customer comes up to you and asks you a question, and you don't know the answer and you just say, I don't know, and you don't follow that up with anything, you know, you do that 3 times and you can no longer work in that environment.
right.
And so learning some of these customer service skills, like how to, you know, answer a question, how to follow up on a question that you got, right? How to do a little bit of research and come back to someone. I mean, these are things that could be worked on, you know, certainly with some educator support. But those, you know, a lot of these soft skills are the things that make a huge difference.
Huge difference. And they're things we don't think about because we just have them, you know,
Right.
and especially our young people with autism who, you know, everything is very black and white for them, and there's so many gray areas in some of these jobs. So just starting really basic and getting your own idea of what that looks like for them, you know, can definitely be done at home. So here's our next question. This is from an anonymous attendee. Do you recommend students looking into college prep programs or navigator prep programs for one-on-one counseling for students looking at college as their next step?
So just in terms of,
so like a college prep program, like for high school, I mean, this is just my own experience, is sometimes they don't have a very good understanding of working with students with IEPs.
Right.
You know, so I have seen challenges there.
There are, I mean, it very much, I think that's the question, is sort of like, there's not one type of program that's recommended. It does depend on whether the particular program has knowledge of students with learning disabilities. I mean, there are a couple of college counselors that I work with pretty frequently who do, you know, either only work with students with learning disabilities or have some experience. There are some, you know, test prep kinds of programs that are very specific for students with learning disabilities, but you want to make sure that whoever the provider is familiar with the type of student that you are sending to the program.
Right. Okay, here's our next question. This is coming from a person working with an 11th grade student whose handwriting is very difficult to read, but the school dropped handwriting in the 6th grade. The parents are concerned about paper job applications. Can handwriting for the application process be included on the TPF? Yes.
I mean, yeah, handwriting. Handwriting can be included for all students. Nancy, can you repeat, how old was this? Is the student now?
11th grader.
Okay, 11th grade, and it was dropped in 6th grade. I mean, the thing that gets really challenging. So one of I work with a team of professionals at NESCA, and so we have a number of neuropsychologists on staff, and then I have a colleague that I work really closely with who's an occupational therapist. And one of the things that becomes really challenging with handwriting, you know, after 6th grade level is whether the student is motivated to work on handwriting or not. And so on the one hand, yes, it's really appropriate to work on handwriting for college applications, for medical applications, for being able to handwrite a thank you card in an appropriate situation. I mean, there's lots of reasons that it's totally appropriate to continue, and signatures. I see a lot of students who actually do have the motor capabilities to complete a signature, but that skill hasn't been worked on. And, you know, it's just thinking about, you know, having the dignity to be able to fill in some of these things by hand if that's a choice the student wants to make. And so it is appropriate. However, if the student is just completely impossibly unmotivated to build handwriting skills, that's a tough uphill battle. You would want to think about how to creatively motivate that student, or maybe some other exercises, you know, to work on the handwriting piece. But there does have to be a little bit of intrinsic motivation to be successful with that skill if we're thinking about an 11th grader and later.
I guess my mind went straight to build on computer skills better, because not a lot of job applications are paper anymore, and very few people would recommend or even want someone to fill out a job application at the place of business. So if this is a young person who might get services from the Massachusetts Rehabilitation Commission, MRC, someone could help him fill that out. Because I guess I don't see them getting good enough handwriting to even want them to fill that out, because if it's messy even slightly, an employer's not going to read it, because it's an easy way to screen people out. So making sure they can, you know, working on online applications, which are impossibly hard for like me. I have a master's degree and I get on there and I'm like, this is so hard. Why do you make it so hard? And it's so that people quit filling it out, and it's a way to screen people. So working on those skills, I see, as someone who has always helped people get jobs with disabilities, as being maybe more important than great handwriting, unless, you know, whatever their vision for their job is, then, you know, then if they need handwriting, then for sure start working on it, but maybe focus on something that's a little bit more long-term or beneficial, like online job applications, really good typing skills, you know, that kind of thing.
Well, and the other thing to remember is with a job application, it is okay for somebody else to do the handwriting on the job application. If you happen to actually be applying for a job where they still have the paper-based applications, it's rare to say, like, do these on the spot. You know, it's usually something you would pick up and then drop back off. And so it's okay for somebody else to fill that out. I do think, again, I think we underestimate the value of handwriting in adult life, because there are often times that you do need to be able to handwrite a note that somebody else can read on the top of something. And so I think, you know, depending on where somebody is with that, think about whether it truly might be important for their employment or not.
Right.
and don't don't totally give it up. But yes, you need to work on the technical skills as well for other
Right.
aspects.
All right, let's go to the next question here. My son is currently in high school. He is non-speaking and has an intellectual disability and autism. What assessments should we be looking at? As parents, we are at a loss for a direction for him. He needs support in all aspects. Do you have suggestions for kids with this type of profile? I think the team is at a loss of what to do.
Yeah, so I mean, for most students with similar kinds of profiles, right, like students who are unable to communicate or express their interests unsupported are often students that we think about a more traditional, what we call a person-centered planning process, where you bring in parent, family professionals who know the student well, and we often do like a more sort of like a visually representative model of transition planning for the student. But the idea is assessment of that student is going to require observation of the student and a lot of feedback from people who know that student well. And so certainly there are different adaptive functioning measures, and you're looking at measures that are talking about, is there anything that he does completely independent or more independently or a little more successfully? When you're in different community environments, are there different environments that the student responds to in a little bit more engaging or excited kind of a manner? Where do we see the strengths and success? And a lot of times that is, you providing interview information or teachers providing interview information. And then some of that is, okay, we do sort of baseline assessment process for the student, looking at transition planning areas and looking at different skills. And then some of that is that we have to set up a transition plan where we are exposing the student to a lot of different activities and environments and really working towards, a little bit more independence, a little bit more success over time. I do think, one of the things you'll notice if you look at Massachusetts transition planning form is that the vision statement there on the transition planning form talks about in collaboration with the parents,
Right.
to identify the student's goals for post-secondary life. So, this is your child that you have been watching for years, and it's sort of like, what do you think would be successful and satisfying quality of life after high school? Is it being around people or not being around people? Is it, it's just sort of like thinking toward what are the kinds of engaging activities that we want to be part of his life after high school, and what's it going to take to get there?
Kelly, there's that the Charting a Life course tool that actually kind of breaks out this information a little bit more. And if you Google Charting the Life course, has a little bit more questions than the TPF form, and can maybe help the team to, think about a happy life for this young person. Like, what does that look like? And different services, community, family, state agencies, and all of these different things to kind of come up with ideas for services.
I think we're seeing Mass Department of Education has taken a lot of interest in Charting a Life course, and ARC of Massachusetts has taken a lot of interest. And so we're seeing more people in Massachusetts who are familiar with this model of planning for adult life, but there are other educators and professionals who might be more familiar with MAPS or plan or, like another kind of person-centered planning. And so I would want to, check in with your school team to see like what models are they familiar with. If it's none, then, we need to bring somebody into the team who's familiar with, planning for a student who's more challenged in communication in the long term. It may be that there's just not somebody part of the team right now who has expertise in this area.
Right. And I think we're out of time for the next two questions, because I wouldn't want to ask them and then not be able to finish the question, because we are done here at 11. And we've got just about a minute left. But I'd like to thank you so much, Kelly, for doing this. I think this was an amazing amount of information for people. And to, think about transition planning from home seems overwhelming to me as someone who works in the field. But I think that you gave people a lot of great ideas for things that they can be doing at home and working with their school district to, you know, make sure that the young people who are in their houses, who they're working with, or the professionals that are working with these families and young people, you know, can keep moving young people with disabilities forward while we're remote learning, which who knows what next year will look like.
Yeah. And I think just like everything else that we're doing right now, it's sort of looking at the IEP and seeing what are the transition services that have already been agreed on, and trying to make sure that those are happening, you know, if they can. But you may right now with your child at home have noticed some transition services that you've never realized you needed before. Right. And, you know, it's appropriate to then have IEP meetings and talk about this and think about, you know, over time how to address these things. And I just really appreciate having the opportunity to be here today and talk about that, and to be able to continue to think creatively about transition services with you, Nancy, and with other folks over time.
Yep. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Enjoy the sunshine. Hopefully it's sunny where you are. I'm sitting right in the sun and it feels great. So thank you so much, and take care, everyone.